Hello everyone and welcome to the first video of Chess with Arnaud. Today I'm going to be showing you a full repertoire easy to play for black against the Catalan Opening. So for me the Catalan is probably the most disgusting opening to play against as black, and I have faced many problems against it until I discovered this variation. So well, I hope you also enjoy it and you also are able to get great results with this variation. So after d4, the move I'm going to suggest is knight f6, especially if, as me, you are players of the Grünfeld defense, or even if you are players of the King's Indian, or even the Nimzo Indian. Against c4, I will recommend you to play g6, and against knight f3, bishop g7. So my whole point is that since I'm a Grünfeld player, I don't want to play d5 as long as white doesn't threat e4, because if I play d5 here, white has pawn takes, knight takes, and d4. And in the normal Grünfeld here, if I play d5, after e4 at least I have knight takes, pawn takes, and bishop g7, and I'm going to play with c5, knight c6, short castle, and I'm going to put a lot of pressure under the center. But if instead, I play with d5 without my rival having committed to knight c3, cd5, knight takes, and d4, and suddenly black has some objective problems because the center is no longer under pressure, and after knight b6, for example, a move as simple as bishop e2, and white enjoys a good edge. So I recommend bishop g7, knight c3, here you can play d5, which is my recommendation entering into the Grünfeld defense, but this is not the Catalan, so I won't be covering this. So here I will be covering the move g3. So short castle, bishop g2, and there's a move that in my opinion is so important to remember here, which is the move c6. Okay, so why don't we want to play d5? Basically because of the same reason that I have expressed before. Knight cd5, knight d5, and d4 will cause some problems to the black pieces. Instead, if we play c6, our idea is that after a move such as short castle, we are going to play with d5. And now with cd5, our idea is not to take with the knight, which will be terrible, because now after e4, this position is even worse because the pawn on c6 is restricting our b6 knight and leaves us without the possibility of playing c5. But I will be recommending cd5 with an extremely solid position, but also with some winning chances, especially in the secondary variations, which there are a lot. But well, I would also like to clarify that if the white player, instead of entering into the Catalan by disorder, plays g3, it's important to play here immediately c6. Why? Because if we play bishop g7, then bishop g2 is threatening e4. And again, this is not a good moment to play d5, because after cd5, knight takes, there's e4, and since there's no knight in c3, white will have a very comfortable position and definitely a slight advantage. So instead of this, my recommendation is to play c6. So after bishop g2, there's d5, and this is commonly going to transpose to the lines we are going to see in the main order with knight f3, because at some point white will have to develop this knight. For example, here knight f3, bishop g7, short castle transposes to this exact position, which is, in my opinion, the main starting point of the whole defense. So this is called the Symmetrical Grünfeld, basically because both sides are playing a Grünfeld. Probably white has the better side, because of the extra tempo and the pawn on c4 instead of on c6. But the position remains equal, and I think this is one of the best ways to play against the Catalan, and one of the most trendy ones. So here white has a ton of moves, probably 10 moves if I'm not bad. All of them are objectively equal. Black has many ways to equalize against all the moves, but some of them are harder, and some of them are more principled approach than other ones. So probably the main line at all levels is the move cd5, entering into some kind of exchanges left positions, but I think this move is so unambitious as white, because here black has so many ways to equalize. I will be providing you the one that I consider to be the most active one, because other variations don't leave black with so many winning chances. So here, as I have said, c takes d5 is the best move by far, and the only good one. And here usually white plays knight c3. So after knight c3, we are going to try to keep an equal position and symmetric by playing knight c6. Our whole point is that we both just want to develop. These knights here are in their best spots because on d7 they will be restricted, and on a6, of course, they don't make much sense. For example, a move such as a6 will completely restrict them. So the c6 square is the best one by far, and it also leaves us with the possibility to play an eventual e5, aiming for some isolated queen's pawn positions, which can be interesting. They are not my preference, but it's an interesting idea, of course. Although I will be recommending something similar in this version. So here by far, white's main move, I'm going to turn on the engine, not for me, because I already know this version, but for you to be able to show the evaluation of each position. So here the main move as white is knight e5, and here my recommendation is to simply play bishop f5, keeping the development. So here white has to make a choice, and it's not easy, because there are two moves here. Probably bishop f4 is the best one, or at least in my opinion. And here my recommendation is to play rook c8. So after knight takes e6, we can take with the rook, follow up with a6 b5, and black has a nice position. We will have to be flexible with the move e6 because this bishop can suffer some problems because of the g6 pawn restricting it. So overall here, the main idea is to play a6, b5, queen a5, b4, and try at some point some queen b6, rook c8, and play on the queen side. This pawn is gonna have to protect it at some point with either bishop e6 or e6 if this bishop is safe enough. And overall, white's plan is going to be to play on the king side, try to play against this bishop, try to play against this pawn, and try to play sometimes on a center with moves such as queen b3, which is the last move I'm going to be covering on this variation, because here after rook b6 I consider that black is fully equalizing. Here it will probably be weird for you that after queen a3 this plan is no longer available, but black can just play queen a6, rook a6, keeping the threat to the queen, and eventually white will have to either repeat or make a weird move such as queen b4, which will allow rook b6 of course, but would also allow queen d7 ideas, and the queen here might be misplaced in some variations and is no longer pressing the d5 pawn. So here black might even get a tiny edge. Instead, the most played move here is knight takes e6. Now, what do I think? This is not a big challenge. Well, after b takes e6, this opens black's a lot of possibilities to play with e5, and it will no longer result in an isolated queen's pawn position, because now the c6 pawn will also be supporting black's center, and it will result into a hanging pawns structure. So here bishop f4 is the most logical move. Knight a4 is also an interesting idea, I mean to play knight c5, but here black has the move knight d7, protecting this square, aiming for a possible c5 at some point, also aiming for a possible queen a5, and putting pressure under this pawn. Here, for example, bishop f4 will be a reasonable idea as white, but here after queen a5, white enjoys a really good position. The idea of this move is to play c5 while putting some pressure under this knight. And here white does no longer have a big plan. For example, rook c1 is the idea here, but here there's the important move knight b6, taking profit of the fact that rook takes wouldn't work because of knight takes a4, of course, and that also knight takes b6 wouldn't work because of a takes b6, improving black's pawn structure and putting pressure under the a2 pawn. So here the only attempt to get something as white will be knight c5, but after queen takes a2 the position is more or less balanced. This queen is gonna exit at some point with some queen takes b2 and eventually using the c2 square after rook b1, or is gonna try to retry by playing some queen a5 knight c4 maneuver allowing this diagonal. So, as I have said, the main move here is bishop f4, and my recommendation will be to play the move knight d7. Again, I'm into play c5, but not just to play c5, but also to play e5, which is an easier move to get. After rook c1, e5, breaking at the center, and here you will know that although while we'll have a healthier construction, black will get a super easy piece play and a super active one. e5 is pretty much first. As you can see, every other option is terrible. For example, bishop e3 will just run into e4 with a huge space advantage for black, and the ideas of bishop e6, f5, f4, which will already be causing some problems to this ugly bishop and to this king. So after d takes e5, knight takes e5, this move is important because bishop takes e5 will just be trading our best piece for one of our rivals' worst one. Here after bishop takes, knight takes, this position is already wide advantage because of two reasons. First of all, the one that I have just mentioned, we've traded our g7 bishop by the f4-1, which is generally not a good trade, but also because this kind of pawn structures, when minor pieces get traded, tend to be more weak. So we'll try to play knight takes e5, keeping more pieces. Here, of course, bishop takes e5 will allow bishop takes e5 with already an edge for black, thanks to the bishop pair. And here knight a4 is pretty much the only choice, the only move for white. I won't be covering anything else because I don't think anything else is a threat. Probably b3 is the only other move, but it's not that easy to figure out why it's a good move because after all, you are weakening this diagonal. But that's also the point of this move. You don't want to have the pawn on b2, so this bishop no longer gives pressure under that pawn, and you will eventually try the same maneuver. So after knight a4, my recommendation will be to play rook e8, putting the rook on the semi-open column. As you can see, black's play is super easy. We just want to play with the piece activity. At some point we might try some knight c4, threatening b2, putting pressure on e2, and well, with a good position. And here it might surprise you because bishop takes e5 here is a good move. Now the reason is that bishop takes e5 just loses the pawn. This was also the purpose of knight a4, but here rook takes e5, and black does really have a good compensation for this one because the rook d7 and now knight c5 is pretty much first. Knight c5, I mean rook c5. Rook c1 is also a possibility, but will allow rook d8, protecting this pawn, and later on black will play this kind of ideas. And as you can see, even if we don't regain the pawn, black is in very good shape due to this active rook putting pressure into this bishop, which is also a good piece that can be traded at any point by this one. This knight on a4, which nowadays is awkward due to the rook on c5 and due to the open c file, which no longer leaves a weak square on c5. And also this bishop on g7 is very powerful. So here, even being a pawn down, black has a nice compensation, and in my opinion a preferable position because it's not easy to play here as white. For example, knight c3 will follow up with d4, rook takes, bishop takes, and for example here knight d5 is forced, and bishop h3 already trading these bishops leaves black with good winning chances and at least equality. Putting pressure on the queen side, opposite color bishops, definitely an equal position. So b3 is now the best move to try to avoid knight c4, and the idea here is to play queen a5. Now, why do we want to play queen a5? Because now knight c5 will run into queen takes h2, so this is a prophylactical move. Here there aren't many moves for white. Probably queen d2 is the best one, trying to play an endgame in which white can argue that this bishop is covering the air and there are weaknesses here. But the truth is that this endgame is far from being white advantage because of many reasons. First of all, this bishop can be replaced via bishop f8 and then a possible bishop c5, bishop d6, bishop a3 ideas. Also, this bishop is chronically bad. It's not like our bishop that can be easily improved. This bishop will need several tempos. It's choking against a whole wall of pawns, so we will need some maneuver like e3, rook d1, bishop f1, which is extremely hard and wouldn't makes so much effect. The other only move here reasonable is bishop d2, but I think here after, for example, queen a6, keeping the queen on the column, so it keeps preventing knight c5 is a good approach. And here eventually black will play rook a d8, something like probably c5 d4 at some point, and the position remains equal. Probably bishop c3 is white's idea, but after this black definitely has enough compensation. So queen d2, and this endgame is just equal with what I have just said to you. Knight c5 is probably the best idea, but now knight a7, trading that knight. And the truth is that here black has a very enjoyable position, because knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, here black already has a tiny edge. Because, for example, e4 is the only reasonable moves, and it makes sense because you want to play e takes d4 and make this bishop alive. But now after d4, one has to be very careful because this is a pace pawn which will be defended via c5. So this position is already probably slightly preferable as black. The only move that white has here to keep the full equality, both practically and objectively speaking, is e4, but in my opinion, d takes e4, knight takes, bishop takes, and rook f1. It's true that white is going to regain the pawn at some point, or at least going to have compensation, but the position is balanced, because black will have a4 ideas. Here there are many choices. I hesitate you to analyze this endgame. Probably bishop f5 is the worst in my opinion, because rook takes e6 and this pawn majority generally favors black. So the move I'm going to recommend here is f5. I advise you that you are not going to reach this position ever in life, but well, here bishop e3 and a5 ideas already give black counterplay. We have to take in consideration that black is a pawn up, so white is the one who has to be careful here. So with that being said, I'm going to analyze now, instead of knight c3, what happens if black plays bishop f4, which is an interesting move, I would say. So the idea of bishop f4 is that black wants to play queen b3 and start putting pressure while keeping this knight flexible. Why does white want to keep this knight flexible? Because it can sometimes go to c3 as in the main line, but it can also go to d2 and try to play with e4, or trying to play with knight a3 and knight b5 in some lines in which black has committed to an ugly move, like for example a5, to try to play against this queen. So here I believe queen b6 is the best move. Basically because what I have said before, queen b3 is white's idea. This move is not really preventing it. In fact, queen b3 is the only good move in this position because you are threatening both b2 and an eventual d4. So for example, e3 will just run into knight takes b2. But for example, queen c2 will just run into bishop f5 idea, so it's hard to defend both pawns. And queen d2 is not a good move because of knight e4, so as you can see, queen b3 is forced in this position. Knight c6 is also a good move, but I didn't want it to run into this kind of positions, because I think white usually gets some kind of dynamic counterplay, which I don't like, even though this is completely equal. So I would recommend you to play queen b6, and here after queen b3, queen takes, pawn takes. This is pretty much forced. Otherwise, for example, if knight c6, this endgame now favors white, because contrary to many other positions with this structure, this favors the side that doesn't have the double pawns, because they can easily be blockaded with some knight c3, knight b5 idea. So this is not what we want to do. Instead, we want to trade ourselves. So after pawn takes, we have knight c6 ideas. I'm into playing knight b4, and here there's a curious line with knight c3, bishop f5. This endgame is quite easy. Okay, I won't be explaining this too much. But I will show you an interesting line, a finding that I made here. Usually, black's idea is to keep this pawn flexible, because if you play with a6, there might be knight a4 ideas, and if you play with a5, you're already weakening a little bit. the b5 square and also the a5 pawn. So the idea is to keep this pawn flexible and try to play with the weaknesses on the b file. So here rook a4 is a move, trying to avoid knight b4. And after e6, b4, a6, rook fa1. There's a great move here, and probably the only equalizer. Here b5 is the threat. So here the greatest move is g5. And to my eye, this is just an extremely good move, because the idea is that if knight takes g5, there's bishop c2, and once this rook moves, there's knight takes b4 with advantage. If bishop takes f4, same idea. Knight c2, knight takes b4. And if b5, the idea is to play g takes f4 and then bc6, bc6, knight e5, c5, and black has a nice position. Now you may be wondering, why do we want to play g5 instead of playing, for example, bishop c2? Well, it has to return space, because here after rook a3, g5 is forced. Well, more or less forced. Here knight takes b4 will then be that good, because they move knight e1. And this bishop is having some troubles. As I have told you before, this is very common in this variation. So g5 is so important because of that reason. And here black will have to play some ugly and weird move like rook dca, which will run into bishop d6 ideas. I don't recommend you to enter into any of these ideas as long as you can avoid them. Generally, it's not good to play a bishop c2 on the symmetrical Catalan, or to compromise this bishop without having played a g5. So with this having said, I'm going to cover the other main line, which is the move b3. Now this move was trendy a couple of years ago, and it's still one of the main choices, and in my opinion it's a good idea when one wants to play for the win. But objectively talking, black equalizes here in such an easy way. Why? Because black just wants to play dc4, and after bc4 it looks like we have completely give the white the control of the center, but here we have c5, and the point being that dc5 is of course not possible because of knight e4 or knight e7 ideas, and the same happens with d5. So here there are two moves, e3 and bishop b2. Probably the most critical one is bishop b2, but also the longest one, so I will be first ruby wing e3. Here our idea will be to play knight c6, putting more pressure on this pawn and taking profit of the fact that d5 is never good. Here, for example, just knight e4, and if pawn takes, bishop takes, and we are going to win the exchange. So d5 is never good, so we are putting a nice pressure on the white center. And after bishop b2, my recommendation is to just play queen b2, putting pressure on this bishop. Queen b3 is the move that has been played the most here. It's not a good move. Here there's knight a5, and if queen takes b6, queen takes b6, there's a takes b6 here. And this endgame is very favorable to black, because there's a lot of pressure on under this fixed c4 pawn. There will also be pressure on this a2 pawn. There's pressure under the center. This is never a good idea because of knight takes e4 and also because of bc5. So this endgame is favorable to black. So queen b3 is not a good choice, even though it's the move that has been played here the most times. Instead, white's best choice here is the move queen c1, but here after cd4, ed4, bishop f5, I think black enjoys a very good position. What's the point of bishop f5? Well, we want to activate our bishop and finish our development, but keeping the eye to have the move knight b4 after d5, and this position is very comfortable as black. So probably the only other move here is queen e2, but after cd pawn takes, here the idea is not to play bishop f5, because it doesn't make much sense now with the queen on e2 allowing knight e2 and rook c1 ideas, but to play bishop g4, I mean to play bishop takes and knight takes. So here d5 will be forced, and as a conceptual and as a strategical idea, in this kind of hanging pawns positions, once the pawns are moved, they leave enormous weaknesses. So here knight a5 will just give black a practical edge, because rook c8 is coming, and white's position is really uncomfortable, even though it's near to the equality because of some mystical dynamic compensation with knight a3 ideas. But I repeat, black is super comfortable here. So the other move instead of e3, and the best one, is bishop b2, with the difference being that now white hasn't committed to play e3, which leaves some extra options. And here queen b3 will be good, because now this endgame is never good. And now knight c6, which will be normally the idea. We'll run into d5, and this is no longer that good because there's no pawn on e3. So white hasn't lost that tempo and will be able to play with knight bd2 and play eventually with e4. So instead my recommendation will be to play c takes d4, and after knight takes d4, queen b6. Now this position may look ugly to you, and I understand it because this bishop now has become apparently so powerful. But knight c6 is incoming and we will have an equal position. Queen c2, for example, this is in my opinion the best move here, just protecting the bishop. Otherwise, to do it like queen d2, fall into knight d5, eventual ideas after something like knight c6. And queen b3 now is not that good because there's knight fd7, and black is not going to have any problem here. White can drain our structure, and in case of e3, e5 and knight c5, and the position is so comfortable. So here after queen c2, knight c6 is the idea, trying to fight against this bishop and allow the development of this one. And here knight takes c6, b takes c6, and the position is dead equal because it's completely symmetrical. And even though this bishop is probably better than this one, which is controlled by the b2 bishop, black is more active with his queen, will be more active with the rook, and will have bishop f5 idea. So here I prefer the black pieces. As a general plan, we want to play on the queen side, bishop f5, rook b8, even some kind of a4, a5, a4 pushes, and eventually playing c5 to lift this bishop, hitting there. And I think black has a really good position. So even though b3 is an interesting move because it reaches some unbalanced positions, it also leaves black with many simple equalizing options. Here, probably the other main move in what refers to the number of the games played is the move queen b3, but I don't think this is a good move. What's the idea of queen b3? So the idea of this move is that black has to make a decision, and apparently it's not easy because if we play something like bishop f5, we will just be losing this pawn without compensation, and now queen b6 will then be that good because after knight c3, this structure is not so favorable after the queen's exchange. In fact, this is good for white. There's a game here between Abhimanyu Mishra and Danish Giri from the last FIDE Grand Series, in which the white player got a nice advantage. The game ended up in a draw, but I'd recommend you to see it. And this is not that good because the pawns on d5 haven't been traded, so these ones are double pawns but not isolated. So instead, the idea that I'm going to suggest is to play a5. And this move is so good. Okay, this move is so good. What happens now is that if a4 wouldn't be a good move, there will just be knight a6 ideas, either directly or having played dc4 first, but these ideas will be there because the b4 square now is weak. So cd4 is pretty much forced, and now the idea is not to take directly, because that will allow knight c3 entering into b5 with probably an edge for white, but to play a4. Now white has to play queen d1, and after cd5, knight c3, our idea now is to play knight e4. So this wasn't possible with the queen on b3. This wasn't possible with the queen on b3, because as you may be looking here, now knight e5 makes no kind of sense, because you are just hanging this pawn on many variations. So instead we play a4, queen d1, cd5, knight c3, knight e4, and what happens now is that knight takes a4 is not a good move because of queen a5, and suddenly white starts to have problems. This knight is threat, and if knight c3, then knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and black is already more active and in a better situation. Knight c6 is coming, probably bishop g4 is coming, g6 is coming, and definitely white has some problems. So here probably the best move is knight d2, but again it's not so easy to figure out why. You just want to trade this knight, but this position doesn't look so comfortable as white, and in my opinion here black is doing pretty well. And well, the only other choice is to play knight takes e5, which in my opinion is a terrible move, and also in the engines one, because after d e5 this knight has no good squares and this pawn is threat. This is a very common theme in the Grünfeld, Once the white player takes on e4, there's the e4 opening up the queen and opening up the action onto against this pawn, and it will eventually fall. Knight e5 will be the only choice to try to protect this pawn, but after f6, which is not really a weakening move. This is weird because usually f6 is not what you want to play. But after f6, black will have a great advantage, because now this knight just has the c4 square, and now the idea is to play f5, and you may be thinking, why have you done that? Because now knight e5 is possible again. But the truth is that here, black can just play knight c6. If knight takes, b takes, and the d4 pawn will eventually either fall or leave some enormous weaknesses in its back. For example, if white tries something like this, there are always bishop a6, bishop d3 ideas, and also c5 ones. So after knowing that a5 is a good move, I don't think the queen b3 line is challenging anymore. And here I will cover now the line with knight bd2. This is somewhere in between the main and the secondary lines. It's played, but not so much. Now, what's the idea of this move? Well, white simply wants to play b3, bishop b2, and get a comfortable position. But since we know that this is white's idea, we want to play a5, and against b3, a4. And this is quite an uncomfortable position already for white. I mean, not uncomfortable objectively talking, but white has to make a decision so early in the opening. And it's not so easy, because if you play bishop b2, you are going to be worried every time because of a3 moves. And otherwise, if you take on a4, you aren't going to win any pawn, because I'm just going to play queen a5. I'm going to recover it with a better pawn structure. So here bishop b2 is the best move, but after bishop f5 we are activating. Now white has to make a decision, which is usually to play e3. And here my recommendation is to just play knight e7, complete the development. And this position is comfortable because black will play with rook e8, and eventually will play with knight e4, knight takes, in case of knight takes, bishop takes, and then try to play for an a3 and then for an e5. For example, if white leaves us with a couple of tempos, we are going to play some kind of ideas, including these moves. This is our general plan in this kind of positions, play a3 and then e5. So the position is so comfortable, and black doesn't really have anything to worry about. Here, for example, f3, knight e7, and queen e2, black will just play rook e8, I'm going to play an eventual e5, or an eventual c5, both are interesting. I usually prefer e5 ideas. And here, e6. Why? Because we can play e5, it will just lose a pawn. And if we play knight e4, there's knight takes, and here bishop takes is not that good because of cd5. And if cd5, this bishop is a bit weird and it allows queen b5 ideas, and this position is a bit uncomfortable. So instead I recommend to play e6 and fight for c5. Here there's a very curious line. I will pass it extremely fast because you won't reach this position probably. But b4, a3, bishop c3, knight b6, putting pressure, rook ac1, queen a4, knight a4, knight e5, h5, h3, g5, grabbing space on the king side. And if b5 here, black's idea is to play knight b2. Just I mean to play an eventual knight d3 idea. So pretty, so pretty. Of course, bishop takes b2 is terrible, and otherwise if black plays just a waiting move, first of all, cd5 pawn takes, and knight takes d1 will be winning the rig. But if white moves the rig, then there are problems, because in this kind of positions there are going to be bishop d3 ideas, which will be extremely important after something like knight d7. So well, here black is already in a preferable position. And the last line I'm going to review today, there are 10 lines to analyze. I'm going to review the 5 main ones today, and probably the other 5 in another video. The other line that I'm going to be reviewing is the move, which one is it, sorry? The move knight c3, which is probably the one you'll see the more when you play online, especially if you are at an intermediate level, or even a level 1, below 2000 points of elo online. Probably this is the move that you will see the most. So, in my opinion, this is a harmless myth objectively talking, but practically speaking, it's an interesting try. Why? Because here we are forced to take the pawn. And here what you will see the most in your games is that while players will play knight e5 and will get lost, because here there's knight e4, this interesting trick. And the point being that if knight takes e4, there's queen takes d4, and this endgame is incredibly good for black. We are going to have the more active pieces because this bishop is choking to a wall, and we are going to finish our development with bishop e6, knight a6, knight b4 ideas, following by an a5, a4, a3, putting pressure on the queen side. So this endgame is incredibly good, and if white tries to keep the queens and realizes his mistakes and plays knight takes, bishop takes, this position is also so comfortable. Basically, there are no plans to grab the center with e4 because the pawn is pinned, and black will just try to play an eventual b5. b5 without the knight being able to jump to e5 and put pressure on c6 is always a good move in the Catalan. But here white's idea and the challenging move is to play e4, and this is a sacrifice very common in the Catalan. Magnus Carlsen has played this a lot, and in fact here I'm going to show you a game between Magnus Carlsen and Reza Firouzja. I hesitate you to analyze independently this variation because it's extremely hard to play for both sides, but definitely here b5 is the best move, aiming to play b4. And here after queen e2, trying to fight against b4 ideas because there will be knight a4 and the c4 pawn will eventually fall. a5, rook d1, knight b7, just trying to complete our development. And d5 here is a super interesting move. cd5, e5. This is a super sharp line, so I hesitate you to analyze it because of this is a YouTube video and I don't want to make it 3 hours long. I won't be spending too much time explaining this variation, but here black has to play b4. And after ef6, knight takes f6, and this is a super weird position in which black has got 3 pawns for the piece. These pawns are going to create a pace 1 so soon, but white has some blockade on the center. It's an extremely weird position, but after knight b5, e6, here black is in pretty good shape. Generally, black wants to play bishop d7 because this knight is in a weird spot, so we will try to play knight e7, bishop d7. So here a4 is first, because now bishop d7 the knight will be protected, and this is never a good idea because there's either knight takes or rook takes, which in this case makes even more sense. We've ruined the overall pawn structure and this pawn is weak. So bishop d7, bishop e3, and I'm going to quickly review the Magnus Carlsen game here. Well, wait, it's not in this line, the Carlsen game. But well, this is the angel line which equalizes 0-0 in quite a good shape. The idea that Firouzja played, which is also good, is bishop d7 first, that can transpose, and this was his idea. This is more or less a transposition, not completely but similar. And Firouzja eventually played with a4, queen b6, won a pawn, started controlling these squares, and eventually played with a3, played with this kind of ideas to eliminate this pawn and make this two, well, this one is already, but make the c pawn also paste them. And well, here this was a Firouzja masterclass. I mean, this game is so good for, on the Firouzja side, especially considering that it was a rapid online tournament. Here, this endgame may look that white is pressing due to the king situation. But in fact the king is pretty safe and white's chances here are only to draw. And here, as I have said, Firouzja eventually managed to play with a3 and create a pace pawn, which eventually ended up promoting. In this exact position, Magnus Carlsen resigned. I don't really understand why to play queen d7, but okay. So, well, that's it for today's videos. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope this provides you an easy to play repertoire against white's main choices in the Catalan, especially if you are Grünfeld players. And well, see you soon. I hope to make another video in the following week or even in this one, covering the secondary variations that I haven't showed yet. So well, I hope you subscribe and see you soon, guys. Goodbye.